I think this is a great second conversation to follow up with Dan, because what we heard from Dan a little bit is there's some data on the Solana blockchain, apparently. And so the question is, what do you do with that data? What do you understand from it? And I think Jim's going to really help us through that. So Jim, introduce yourself, tell us your background and a little bit of what Flipside is about.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here. I'm Jim. I'm the CTO, co-founder of Flipside, and we're a growth engine for blockchain ecosystems. We work with about 40 plus different ecosystems on their growth, Marinade included in that. And we really focus on helping ecosystems acquire, activate, and retain users over the long term. We have a very data science driven approach that we take to that.
So growth engine, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. What does it exactly mean in the context of a blockchain like Solana?
Yeah, there's an analogy we use often at Flipside when we think about growth. The way we think about it is we call it the milk roll effect. And the story I like to often tell is in the early 2000s, the Tesco supermarket was looking at the inventory of just different things on their shelves and thinking about which products are poor performers. And milk rolls, turns out, is the worst performing product on their shelves. And so they were about to get rid of milk rolls, and they had recently acquired this data analytics company called dunnhumby. And dunnhumby came along and said, actually, your top 1% of your buyers actually come into the store to purchase milk rolls. And then they go on to purchase a bunch of other things. And so we often think about blockchains in this way, right? Like when you're in an ecosystem and you look at all of the protocols that exist, all of the applications that exist, there's lots of different reasons that people come into an ecosystem. And then there's lots of different complementary products. And so what we're constantly looking for in an ecosystem is what are all of those different products? And then what are the behavior sets that are driving users to show up? And then we've built a system essentially that does exactly that.
Great. And I guess the cool thing with blockchains is you have these wallets, right? And you can probe all sorts of things underlying the wallet. So do you want to kick us off with an example of what that looks like?
Yeah. Just to kind of start off, though, I'm going to talk a lot about the lens by which we look at these ecosystems through. We think about every address in an ecosystem as a scored address. So we've spent a lot of time basically analyzing millions of different types of transactions and then teasing out behavior sets that we know to matter in terms of growth. And then we score every address in an ecosystem on a scale of 0 to 15, 0 being the most inactive, 15 being the most active. And I think what's fascinating is that when you plot this and you look at the distribution, you have a lot of 0 to 1 addresses you see on this chart here. And there's about 600 million addresses, give or take, in crypto today, but actually only about 2% of those addresses actually are showing any real engagement. So if you're launching a new form of a digital product, you have to be asking yourself, are you activating the right types of addresses? And our scores, provide a window into doing that. And I can show you a couple examples of kind of what that looks like, why it matters. So here, what we're looking at is the first chart. Just want to point out on the top left, which is really fascinating, is if you score an ecosystem and you look at all the addresses, if you can move an address from 0 to 4 to above a 4 plus, all sorts of special things start to happen. These high-scoring users, they retain at 3 to 5x the low-scoring users, and then those users also commit 20x the rate of capital in terms of staking as low-scored users. And so if you can target those users, you can materially impact the retention or any sort of really key stats in your ecosystem that you're trying to drive. And so that's the lens at which we look at sort of every problem on a blockchain in terms of activating users or retaining those users.
So I guess then we can get selfishly a little what this means for Marinade staking and where we're going, because just even what you said about staking is really interesting. So, what does the Flipside score look at when you aim it at Marinade and staking?
Let's look at kind of staking as a whole here. And let's look at the top two charts. So the chart on the left-hand side is Solana, the distribution of Solana addresses and how they're scored. This is pretty typical. You have a lot of addresses in 0 to 1. These are new users that show up, or they're users that really aren't adding any value. Maybe they did one action and they left. What we typically like to see is what we see more to the right, which is actually the staking ecosystem on Solana, where you have lots of users that are in the 4+ range. I mean, this is actually pretty amazing for an ecosystem, have this many addresses in the 7 and 8 range here. And then like you think about, okay, like what does that mean? Well, okay, because of that, we actually have this behavior that's interesting, right? Like high scored addresses are staking more often, and then they're also staking more over time. So this is actually a really healthy picture and base that Solana has built in terms of staking, in terms of the behaviors that you want to see in a healthy staking ecosystem.
Great. So it seems like it's healthy, but are there some things to watch out for?
I mean, I would say, and we're going to talk about this slide, but health isn't the same as resilience, and so the one I would say call out is that 45, and sort of take some of the top protocols here. 45 whales control about 40% of all staked liquidity today on Solana. And so that's a really large concentration, and that's a problem for two reasons. One, there's only so many whales that really can be fought over to bring liquidity into an ecosystem. And then the second piece there is just the risk of a whale leaving an ecosystem and then your TBL nosediving in that ecosystem.
Just on the spot, I'm curious, how do you define a whale? Is this 1 million sol?
Yeah, it's in this case, we're looking at the top, it's a top percentile that controls
like wallet address.
Yeah,
so the
exactly.
top wallet addresses. So 45 whales, that the first 1 to 45, you add them up, that's 40% of.
Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And I assume a lot of that's static too, right? From the early days?
There is a lot of static stuff, but I would also say a lot of these end up being known entities as well, which is, what's interesting is I think a lot of people try to go after the whales because you can actually identify them, you can build relationships with them. Some of them are quasi-institutional. But like I said, there's only so many of them to actually go after. And in the chart I just showed, there are thousands and thousands of addresses that actually do bring considerable amount of wealth to the ecosystem. Maybe not the scale of whales, but that you could actually target and bring into your ecosystem.
So what do you think is the upside play for newer existing protocols or users in this scenario?
So I think about what I would think about is like your first contact engineering. So 88% of stakers today, they never use a second staking protocol. And so if you can be that first touch point, you can basically capture that user and really capture them for life. And so I think the interesting thing about Solana is that there are tens of thousands of users that have never staked before. And then another data point is that Solana, more than most ecosystems, is incredible at graduating users from this sort of low scoring cohort into a high scoring cohort. And so if I were starting a new protocol or even an existing protocol, I would be identifying those addresses that are in the low scoring range. I would be maturing them up. And then you have a user that has the behavior set that you want, right? That's not going to churn in terms of staking, that's going to stick around. And if you could, get 100 of those, you could probably get comparable to, maybe what a small whale is. And so if you could do that over and over, then you can actually build a pretty diverse ecosystem.
Interesting. Sounds like a business development plan. This is very helpful. So thank you. So how does the Solana ecosystem stack up against the rest of the industry? Is this like specific staking to Solana, or is this just how staking works writ large?
Yeah. Let's flip to this, which is this is just a chart of looking at LST swap volume and LST swappers by chain. And here we're just looking at Avalanche, Polygon, Ethereum, and Solana. And I use LST swap volume and swappers as sort of a proxy for the utility that exists in the ecosystem and what you can do with liquid staking after you've staked. And I think what's striking here is that Solana has 3x the LST swap volume and about 8x the number of individuals that are swapping versus Ethereum, despite Ethereum having probably it's about 3x the LST related TBL.
Maybe that's because it's like $50 a swap on Ethereum.
Yeah, it might have something to do with it.
Might have something to do with it. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's also, one of the things that we look at is the LST piece versus the native piece, because the majority of stake on Solana is natively staked, but then you have this sort of 10% LST piece, which, has a different use case. So do you have any ideas on what's driving, apart from my joke about $50 for Ethereum, why there's more activity on Solana?
Well, I think that's a very legitimate call out. I think the low transaction fees allow for a lot of experimentation on chain. And also the speed at which things can be executed just allows for a lot of different types of applications to be built. But I would also say there's this interesting flywheel of just I would say these almost like DeFi Legos just compounding on one another. And just the utility of what you can do is exploding. And so I think the two of those in combination, the rapid experimentation at a cheap rate that's enabled, plus what the Solana Foundation has done in promoting just new protocols being developed, I think is one of the reasons that we have this picture here today.
Yeah, I know. I think it makes sense, and it makes sense based on my own user behavior. I remember when I first came over to Solana, I did have this, like, you had this thing on Ethereum where you're like, wait, do I really want to spend this much and take this much time, versus here, because you don't really think about fees and it's so quick, you can sort of go in and out of these projects. So, beyond liquid staking, what macro shifts should founders be designing for in the Solana ecosystem?
Yeah. There's two things that we pay a lot of attention to at Flipside today. And so one of those is just the growth of stables. I think I was at a talk actually like 6 months ago, and I thought someone had a really interesting analogy for how to think about how big stables are right now. And they said, if you go outside and you see a Tesla on the road, the frequency by which you see a Tesla driving on the road is the same frequency by which you can think about stable backed dollars existing on chain today. I think it's at about like 240 billion, and I think that's expected to grow to like $2 trillion in the next 4 years.
So in LA, half the population uses stable coins.
Yeah,
was what I mentioned. Okay, thank you for that.
That's probably the takeaway. Yeah. And the other thing is RWAs, right? Like there's I think about $6 billion of those on chain today. I think that's projected to grow to something like 18 trillion by the early 2030s. So like those, I think anytime that you have new capital formation, new types of products that are being launched, right, on chain, the conversation shifts from what if we could build this to, okay, we are building this and there's actually a lot of it, but like, how do I go to market with it? How do I think about distribution? How do I think about users? And so that's the angle by which we think a lot about this. Is like, okay, there's about to be all these new digital products, but how do they plug into what already exists?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And thinking about, the stablecoin piece, I think Cointelegraph had something yesterday, which was over 1% of the US dollar is now pegged to stablecoins, which I found sort of unbelievable. I didn't realize it was that large, and I kind of want to fact check it because it seems kind of unreal.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. And then when you think about a lot of that activity is coming to a chain like Solana, then staking and how that fits in becomes sort of existential to our money supply, which is interesting as well. How do you view decentralization on Solana? Is that something that you track in terms of as a benchmark against other chains?
Yeah, we think a lot about when we think about, decentralization, we think a lot about diversity of users that exist on chain, really. And so like going back to the example about, the large number of whales that are concentrated really on a lot of liquid staking protocols, we look at it through the lens of like, how diversified is that user base that exists? And there is quite a lot of diversity there, but there's also a lot of room to, like I said before, to de-risk a lot of protocols and move more of those users in. At least if I were starting a protocol, that's what I would focus on.
Interesting. And do you track institutional adoption on chains, or is that kind of a hard thing to track? I'm not quite sure how you would do that, but in the case of like an ETF, say, coming on Solana staking, and then stable coins, to the extent that you would define that as institutional, do you have a way to track institutional usage of chains?
Yeah, they show up by their, they're not raising their hand saying, this is my address, but they show up in terms of the behavior patterns that you see, right? Like, I mean, if you think about an ETF, like the ETF flows and those addresses are actually fairly easy to track on chain. Same thing goes with any sort of whale that comes into an ecosystem, or even just the nature by which they're engaging with different protocols. We can tag and identify those behavior sets.
Awesome. So I'm going to steal a question from my CEO because I thought it was a pretty provocative question. So Jim, you and I have known each other for some time. I think Flipside's been around, what, I hate to say, 4 years, 5 years?
8 years.
Oh, shit. 8 years. Yeah, and I'm 40. So 8 years. 3 years from now, what does the type of insights that you bring to blockchain data, what does that look like? Where does that serve within the ecosystem of how people are going to build products and services on top of chains?
Yeah, I mean, I think the space itself is still fairly immature when you think about how to quantify growth and how to quantify user behaviors. We talk a lot about high-level metrics. We talk a lot about TVL or active users. And so, we have this incredible lens at Flipside by which to slice and dice and look at different behavior sets and know, really in particular, like, okay, like if a user on this ecosystem or this chain, if they exhibit this behavior set, has a really high probability if you attach this to it of going and doing this particular action. That type of analytics for growth, that exists in, say, a Web 2 world, but a lot of that doesn't exist in this space yet. And we haven't reached that level of maturity. And so what I would like to see is, more of a kind of broad adoption of what, we refer to at Flipside of intelligence-driven growth. And it's a lot to do with on-chain growth science and more of that adoption in the space. And I think we're getting there. We're trying to lead that charge, but I think we've got some ways to go yet on that.
Yeah, well, it's been fascinating to watch the evolution and growth and as Dan alluded to, all this data on Solana.
Yeah,
it sounds like you're building this. Business intelligence is probably not the right word, but in the without all the weight of that term, the ability we should be able to use that data to build new products and services and businesses in a new and different way because it's such a unique amount of data. Any closing words on Marinade, staking, Flipside, Solana?
I would say the number one thing that we think about always is identify who those milk roll users are, so to speak. If you're launching a product, what are the kind of pre-behaviors that already exist on chain that you can kind of attach into in terms of a flow? And then also just be cognizant of really 2% of addresses right now actually mean anything to an ecosystem. And so when you're thinking about incentives and who you're giving those incentives to, make sure you're actually giving them to people that are going to be fruitful for your ecosystem. I think a lot of people overlook that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah. Thanks, Hadley.